A new Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan is about to be crowned. The high priest of Huitzilopochtli's largest temple is in the capital. He is the son and then nephew of previous Tlatoque. He is young and vibrant, a natural leader. With piercing eyes, slicked back hair, and a strong nose, he looks like a human eagle and is barely 30 at the time of his coronation. It will be the most important coronation the Altepet has ever seen. The young prince stands at the summit of Templo Mayor in front of the lords of allied and enemy Altepeme alike. In celebration, feasts have been given across 4 days. Music and dancing have continued in the temple district uninterrupted, and lavish gifts have been awarded to the emissaries of the empire. Looking over all of this, he stands with his council of advisors awaiting the regalia of his title. With the title of Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, he will be the King of Kings in the Valley of Mexico. From the shadows of history, he will emerge half-seen, described with conflicting reputations: tyrant, coward, zealot. But he knows himself now by only one name: Moctezuma. The empire he will inherit is at its greatest extent, and this young lord plans to push the boundaries further, toward the west and into the Purepechen Empire, toward the south into the endless hills of Oaxaca, and toward its own center, as he dreams of being the Tlatoani to finally lance the Tlaxcalan ulcer inside the Aztec body. Many leaders of those Altepeme are here today, observing the ascension of the man who promises them nothing but death. Despite the tension present, they could hardly turn down the invitation. Such an act would be a declaration of war. Such is the power of empire. And now, in the culmination of this grand ceremony, Moctezuma's council of advisors look on, as do the Tlatoque of his alliance's partners, Texcoco and Tlacopan. Nezahualpili, Lord of the First, swallows his pride watching the ceremony. In the grand tradition of the election of the new Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, it was customary for the Tlatoani of Texcoco to be a decisive vote among the electors. But now, as the Cihuacoatl of Tenochtitlan coronates Moctezuma, the aging Lord of Texcoco cannot help but wonder how this young man, who he sees as imperious and rash, can resolve the growing contradictions of an empire which threatens to split itself into pieces. Nevertheless, Moctezuma dons the turquoise diadem and the cloak of his forefathers, dyed purple in homage to the Toltec civilization he reveres and believes himself to be the heir of. Standing atop the highest point of the largest city in the valley, there is no one to surmount him. He gazes out past the borders of his city, beyond the perimeter of the lake which surrounds it, and off into the distance. He is the center of the known and unknown worlds, the pillar and the foundation of the heavens. His potential is limitless. But, unbeknownst to him, from atop this pyramid, the Lord's fall has been ordained in secret by the same God he has spent his entire life honoring. History will know Moctezuma not by his conquests, nor his patronage of the arts, nor for the luxuries of his palace and court. He will instead, in the cruelest of fates, go down not as the zenith of his empire's power, but its nadir. His legacy will be defined by a failure that is arguably not his own, and his memory will haunt the nation which will succeed him. For with the election of Moctezuma, the clock is ticking down on the final days of the Aztec Empire. Hello, and welcome to Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast dedicated to seeing the history of the Americas from within the visions of the people who lived it. I'm your host, Gavrilo Z. Last week, we introduced Hernan Cortez and the conquistadores lurking in the periphery of the Aztec Empire. Men who retraced the routes of Cordoba and Grijalva before them as they probed Mexico for weaknesses and rumors on their way to find a mythical empire of gold. Just as tensions among the Spanish threatened to tear them apart, Cortez and his captains bound them together with a legal sleight of hand and a seizure of narrative, a consensus manufactured in fraudulent paperwork upon which the entire myth of the conquest would be based upon. This week, we'll be looking at the mirror image of Cortez's legal fictions, the historical fictions at play in history's role for Tlatoani Moctezuma Xochicotzin, paramount leader of the Aztec Empire. Through the centuries, the myth of Cortez has risen at the expense of his Mexica counterpart, at times so totally eclipsing the Tlatoani that his entire historical being has been lost to history's shadows. He is conjured, and the evidence of dreams as a man is insubstantial as the hallucinations which gripped him and shroud his being to us today. The reality is that the story of Moctezuma is one of the most complex and difficult to visualize in the entire saga of the Spanish-Aztec War. Looking directly at the predominant evidence leads us into a mirage of a man. It is only by looking between the lines of written history that we can start to parse the truth that can only be seen in the periphery of our gaze. So let us now turn our gaze directly to that periphery in this week's episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On, a paranoid historical storytelling podcast where history isn't a story repeating, but a conspiracy unfolding. Episode 1.7, Moctezuma, Shadow Emperor of the Aztecs. The fictions begin in the name itself. His proper name, what he would have spoken in Nahuatl, was something closer to Moctezuma, something the Spanish found themselves unable to repeat, rendering it as Moctezuma and known to us in English as Montezuma. Like any great lie repeated often enough, it has come to embody a relative truth, and so any of these pronunciations are today acceptable. And he is further known to us today as Moctezuma II, a regal designation that disguises several other truths history has trained us to unsee. The Mexica would have never referred to him as the second of anything, instead referring to him as Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, which roughly means Moctezuma the Younger, a reference to his predecessor, Huehue Moctezuma, or Moctezuma the Elder, who ruled as Tlatoani from 1440 to 1469. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin ascended to the royal reedmet in 1502 after the death of his uncle Huitzilopochtli. His father had been Axayácatl, the first of the three sons of Huehue Moctezuma to rule as Tlatoani in quick succession. His election had been conducted by the electors of Tenochtitlan without even token efforts to include Texcoco or Tlacopan in the process. The Mexica had decided that Tenochtitlan would decide its fate alone in its ceaseless accumulation of power. But that man we know as the first Moctezuma was never known by that name in his own lifetime. Renamed in death like a Japanese emperor, the first Moctezuma had been known in his own life as Tlatoani Ilhuicamina. When Moctezuma Xocoyotzin ascended to the throne, he reached back into history to rewrite it in his own image. This rewriting of history to serve contemporary myth-making was a practice as old as the Aztec Empire itself, dating back to Itzcoatl's infamous burning of Mexica codices at the beginning of his own reign. Why Moctezuma did this is uncertain. Most likely, it was due to the complexities of Mexica obsessions of lineage and legitimacy. By connecting himself directly to a past Tlatoani, arguably the greatest the empire had known, this new Tlatoani looked to announce his place in the annals of his people, the shining star of its very firmament. And so the reign of this second Moctezuma began, as so many reigns of the new Tlatoani did, with a historical sleight of hand, a change in the collective memory of the people to establish a link between its unstable present and the fantasy of its glory years past. What we do know of this man for certain is that he came from the priestly caste of Mexica society and was educated in the Calmecec and served as the high priest of Huitzilopochtli. It was a role he would continue in even as Tlatoani. As religiously fanatical as the legendary Tlacaelel had once been, Moctezuma understood the role of the gods in the world of the Mexica to be literal and non-negotiable, and saw himself as Huitzilopochtli's most devoted servant on earth. This meant that Moctezuma was an insatiable believer in the power of human sacrifice, believing that the gods had once spilled their own blood to create the world and that this mortal realm could only be renewed with the spilling of more blood. To this end, he also served as a famous general who had captured 4 warriors for sacrifice, achieving the highest rank possible among Mexica warriors. But Moctezuma was not satisfied with past glories. It was the future that became his obsession. Questions of legacy subordinated all other interests. His uncle, Huitzilopochtli, had died in disgrace from wounds sustained from the failure of a dam project in Tenochtitlan. The dam had been meant as a project of land reclamation in the eternally swampy grounds of the capital, a way of clearing more space for the ever more expansive population and ambition of Tenochtitlan. Huitzilopochtli had, against official advice, taken on the project as a personal mark of his power. he had further ignored the advice of Texcocan Tlatoani Nezhualpili about the dam's instability and pressed forward with it regardless of the cost. Huitzult had been proud, obsessed as all leaders are with remaking their kingdoms in their own image. But the dam broke, and the flooding destroyed much of Tenochtitlan and eventually killed its emperor. The memory of his uncle's disgrace hung over Moctezuma like a curse, his uncle's ghost haunting the nephew's present reign. Moctezuma was determined to exorcise that ghost with his empire's most prized tradition, expansion. And so expand he did, carrying on the grand tradition of Mexica conquest, spilling blood and borders all the way down into the Mixtec kingdoms in Oaxaca, and extending the Aztec reach along the southern coast of Mesoamerica all the way to the border of today's Guatemala. As a leader, he proved flexible in mind, capable of carrying out traditions within the empire while also breaking new ground. At his coronation, he attended to all lords of the valley, including those of the despised Tlaxcalans, and showered them with gifts, showed them lavish hospitality, and gave them hallucinogenic mushrooms during the execution of prisoners, and danced in disguise at the height of the festivities in the city center. These displays of excess were as influential as his military campaigns, and demonstrated Moctezuma's understanding that power, rather than being primarily physical, is psychological, the perception of the possessor's ability to achieve its ends. Surely, in that hallucinogenic haze of these ceremonies, Moctezuma's power must have seemed outright cosmic. As he expanded the reach of his territory, he also began to quell the constant rebellions that had been a recurring bug in the Aztec system. Rebelling Altepeme were subdued with the insurmountable forces of the Mexica and Texcoca before being burdened with an even higher tribute. These campaigns kept his warriors sharp and his enemies depleted. The trail of bodies and sacrificial victims attested that the imperial machine could continue to grind along. His accomplishments made him, in historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto's words, the most dynamic, the most aggressive, and the most triumphantly self-confident of all Tlatoani. And so the years went on, and his rule continued. As the years ticked ever closer to 1519, Moctezuma entered his 40s, becoming more consumed with visions of his own mortality. His empire was hitting its expansionary limits, and as his conquest slowed, he worried so too would his vitality. And so he did what all leaders do when their ambitions are thwarted abroad, seek revenge at home with reforms as brutal as his military campaigns. Notoriously elitist, he began his reign with a series of reforms meant to widen the gap between the nobility and the commoners, prohibiting sandals from being worn and jewelry adorning the faces of the latter. Paths to nobility, which had once been open to commoners, mostly by military success, were shut off. Moctezuma even led a purge throughout his own palace, removing all officials appointed by the previous Tlatoque and having them put to death. His reasons for doing so were as practical as they were ruthless. The new Tlatoani of Ixaltepet was traditionally supported by a group of minor lords and nobles known as the Calpultin. The Calpultin of Tenochtitlan represented a concentration of aristocratic power that had, on occasion, challenged the might of the Tlatoani. His uncle Tizoc's brief 5-year reign had no doubt ended as a result of palace intrigues instigated by these demanding nobles. Moctezuma's own father, Ashayakat, had to constantly fend off their encroachments on his power, encroachments that were seen as necessary compromises to maintain their support for his rule. The palace of the Tlatoani had been filled by the sons and hangers-on of these Calpultin acting in all sorts of capacities, from porters to servants to advisors, each of them doubling their duties as spies for their patrons back in the wards of Tenochtitlan, reporting on every move of the new Tlatoani that might be leveraged by the ruling elite. It was a high-stakes game that Moctezuma was unwilling to tolerate anymore. Not only did he dismiss these legions of officials and servants in his court, but as we said, he had them rounded up and executed, burying the secrets of his palace with them. In their place, he appointed a new generation of servants and officials whose political ambitions were more married to his own. In the accusations of later Texcocan historian Alva Istlxochitl, these were the actions of a ruler who sought to make his power absolute. So it was, as we said, a dangerous game. But then again, Moctezuma was infamously a fan of games and a notorious gambler. He would spend much of his time at the ball courts, betting on the matches and showering his subjects with his winnings. Throughout his life, he was known for making dramatic and sometimes confounding gambles in which he staked enormous fortunes on arbitrary outcomes. Like people across Mesoamerica, he saw his life both in the terms of the flesh and blood realities of the day and in a more cosmic sense as the great game played out by the gods on which all of existence rested upon. He took his responsibilities as a spiritual leader seriously by making frequent human sacrifices to the gods, echoing René Girard's claim that violence is the heart and secret soul of the sacred. Without the sacrifice of human beings to the gods, it was believed that the very order of the world would fall apart, and with it the empire that Moctezuma had inherited and sought to perpetuate. These human sacrifices, historian David Carrasco writes, were always performed in religious precincts, and had profound and detailed political purposes as well, often dramatizing the tensions of center-periphery geopolitical relations. When not at war or making sacrifices to Huitzilopochtli in the Templo Mayor, Moctezuma lived in an enormous palace that he had built for himself on the site of what is today the National Palace of Mexico. It was a building so majestic in its stature, with dozens of rooms and endless artistry in its architecture, that all the Spanish chroniclers simply gave up trying to describe it, stating that it was beyond words. Beyond the borders of his own city, Moctezuma was one of the most dynamic reformers of the empire itself. As we discussed in our episode on Ixtlilxochitl 2 weeks ago, the Aztec Empire is a name that does a lot of heavy lifting. This was not a modern state in the way we think of it, with a central government exercising ultimate authority over all the territory it controls. In many ways, the empire was no empire at all, but an extended family quarrel of interlocked families all intermarrying and warring with each other at the opportune moments. Control was informal, suggestible, and constantly subjected to the revised terms. Conquered peoples had much autonomy over their own affairs so long as tribute continued to be sent back to the Mexica and Tenochtitlan. But Moctezuma had grander ambitions, and sought to create something which resembled a truly integrated state inside Mesoamerica. He stationed garrisons across the empire at its most strategic and vulnerable points to ensure his armies were never too far away from potential threats. He tried to enact a system of uniform measurements and currency conversions to make trade easier. He increased the intensity of local Mexica advisors and observers in conquered territories to make sure that Moctezuma's will was always represented at the decision-making tables across his empire. And lastly, he multiplied the network of spies and informants across the land, creating a network of intrigue that, like a spider web, ensured that the bigger the prey, the more easily it became ensnared. On the eve of the Spanish arrival in 1519, he was a lord unlike the land had ever seen before, and he believed his power to be limitless. But as the Spanish Caribbean Empire made its first expeditions into Mexico, with the travels of first de Cordoba and then Grijalva, word of these strangers' arrival did not go unnoticed by the most powerful lord of this land. Moctezuma's spies had been aware of the skirmish that Cordoba had launched and lost against the Maya in the Yucatan. He was further aware that the subsequent voyage of Grijalva had made contact with the Totonacs at the edge of his control on the Gulf Coast. The Totonacs were notoriously unhappy with Mexica control over their territory, and these strangers arriving and negotiating with them was unwelcome news to Moctezuma. Wanting to impress these strangers with the magnitude of his wealth and power, he ordered Tentlil, who we saw in the last episode, to commission the construction of enormous jeweled wheels to give to these strangers as gifts. But Grijalva's expedition left before they could be completed, and it is a cruel twist of fate that it was not the meek and constrained Grijalva that received these treasures, but the obsessive and opportunistic Cortes. And so we have the portrait of Moctezuma on the eve of his destiny. In many ways, it was the most legible of all accounts of him, though no less vulnerable to historical distortions and myth-making. But it is not this version of Moctezuma which interests our story, but the ones which emerge after the arrival of the Cortesista expedition in the Gulf of Mexico in April 1519. That arrival acts like an explosion at the foundation of Moctezuma's historical consensus. a blast which pulverizes stone into sand, which then crystallizes into the historical fragments that refract his image into the seemingly infinite perspectives of the man, which render the total image of him unviewable. Lacking any definitive historical reflection, we're instead left with a Moctezuma who is seen only by the impression of actions which either confirm or confuse whatever ideas we wish to hold about him. What you believe happened to Moctezuma between April 1519 and June 1520 say as much about you as they do the man himself. And the historical record that we do hold remains incomprehensible when taken at face value. By all accounts, a fearsome and successful leader of his people up until 1519, he has been portrayed, vilified, and infantilized by much of the historical literature dealing with his diplomacy with the Spaniards. Often portrayed as cowardly, fearful, and obsequious, he seems in the histories far removed from the typical image of the powerful and cruel Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. Much of this misconception comes from the histories of the indigenous themselves in the wake of the Spanish conquest. In sources such as Bernardino de Sahagun's Florentine Codex, written with Nahua assistance in the Franciscan-run school set up in Tlatelolco in the wake of the Aztec defeat, portrays him as incompetent and indecisive. But these Nahua were not commoners. They were descendants from the nobility and priestly classes of the city, many of them Tlatelolcans, who had their own political agenda against the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan. And they sought out explanations for how their fathers' and grandfathers' generations had been so thoroughly ignorant of the Spanish threat and easily crushed by it once it came. Further sources, like Cortez's Relaciones, are opportunistic histories written on the fly by a man whose relationship to the truth was often scandalous. The Moctezuma seen through Cortez's letters is a man whose every action forced the conquistador to take up the mantle of inheriting the empire Moctezuma wished to abandon. Later, when Bernal Diaz wrote his own spurious memoirs, this version of Moctezuma was refined into a friendlier, more intimate portrait, but a portrait which still flattered the Spanish interpretation of events. Each of these sources portrayed the Spanish as the noblest of friends who had to save Moctezuma in spite of himself. And as the saying goes, with friends like these, there are really many puzzling behaviors attributed to Moctezuma when seen from these sources. From one angle, Moctezuma's behavior does look like that of a man giving up on his claims to an empire upon encountering the first real threat to its existence. Cortez himself would claim in his second Relacion that upon their first meeting, Moctezuma himself surrendered the empire to be a Spanish vassal state. In this sense, the great ruler of Tenochtitlan is one of history's greatest victims. A man without a voice of his own, spoken for in this portrayal by all those who had reason to distort. And so all of our sources on him, the quasi-indigenous codices, Cortez's Relaciones, Bernaldiz's True History, have axes to grind or angles to leverage in their portrayals of Moctezuma. And the portrait that emerges when taking all of these into account is a schizophrenic mishmash of personality traits and behaviors that often fails to understand the context of his actions and the hand he was dealt when it came to the Spanish arrival. Famously, the Florentine Codex reports of several omens experienced in Tenochtitlan in the years leading up to the Spanish arrival. Portents of doom which deeply disturbed Moctezuma, and were said to have haunted him for years, fraying his nerves and leaving him helpless in the face of Spanish aggression, unable to see it as anything other than his fated end at the hands of the gods. Even Moctezuma's own grandson, the historian Tezozomoc, quotes him as having asked his court magicians, "Have you seen these strange omens in the sky, or on the earth, in the caves under the earth, or in the deep lakes?" But what were these omens, and how did they come about in the history of Moctezuma? To tell it from the perspective of Sahagun's Nahua informants, there were 8 principal omens which haunted the Tlatoani. The first was a fiery blaze in the sky that was said to look as though it were a piercing of the heavens, something which appeared over Tenochtitlan, licking the sky like a tongue of fire. The second omen was the temple of Huitzilopochtli setting itself on fire, a heavily symbolic action in Mesoamerican warfare, as we have discussed. Winning forces often set fire to the temples of their defeated opponents. It was said as part of this omen's myth that the people of Tenochtitlan shouted, "Mexicanos, come running, we can put it out, bring your water jars." But when they did so, the water only made the flames grow higher. The third omen was a lightning strike with no sound that set a different temple ablaze. It was thought as though the sun itself had struck it. The fourth was fire again, this time in the sky as the sun was shining. It rolled out in 3 parts that shot out like hot coals. The people of Tenochtitlan were confused and in their pandemonium lost track of the fire in the sky. The fifth was Lake Texcoco's water boiling around the city, which then flooded and drowned hundreds of houses which collapsed into the water. The sixth omen was the sound of a weeping woman heard each night for several nights in a row. The voice of the woman would seemingly cry out, "My children, we must flee far away from this city. And my children, where shall I take you?" When people could get over their fear and peer out of their homes and into the streets at night, they saw no one there. The seventh omen was a strange creature caught by Tenochca fishermen. It looked like a bird covered in ash and shaped like a crane. It was said that they took it to Moctezuma, who inspected it and saw a mirror on top of its head. He examined the mirror and saw in it the night sky during the day. He recoiled, but looked again and saw men riding giant deer across an enormous plain. And the last bad omen was a monster that appeared in the streets of Tenochtitlan, a 2-headed body that was brought to Moctezuma, but disappeared the moment he laid eyes on it. Attributed to the court's magicians and sorcerers, these omens take on a mystical influence and slot nicely in with a misunderstanding of Mexica cosmogony. Another superstition for the heathen emperor to cling to, ignorant of its truth, and despair at their imagined significance. So much so that he was willing to capitulate to the strange invaders these omens seem to have foreshadowed. One can easily imagine Moctezuma, the high priest of superstition, brooding in his temple over the significance of these unusual sightings, at a loss to explain them in any other way other than futility. For us, looking back at them in hindsight, it's too easy for us to understand them as metaphor, stand-ins for the real moments of indecision, uncertainty, and fear that Moctezuma surely, we imagine, must have felt as the unprecedented invasion of the Spanish began. But these omens are neither reality nor metaphor. They are retroactive justification. Invented in the post-conquest annals, they are another seizure of historical narrative. Moctezuma's defeat by the Spanish has its material causes, but in the myths that history has provided us, we see his fall as something ordained by the very gods who betrayed their most devoted follower. It is a tragic fatalism, where Moctezuma stands in for the greater Aztec Empire as a whole. Again, in the words of historian Fernandez Armesto, to give the Aztec over to fatalism robs us of being able to see the Spanish-Aztec War as one which can be considered from one point of view, a clash of equally aggressive, equally dynamic, equally self-confident warrior societies. And that to remove the fatalism of the omens from the story is to see the Aztecs in a clearer light, their aggression uninhibited by omens, their strength undrained by fatalism. Furthermore, the historian argues expertly that all these omens had analogues in the classic texts of the Western canon that these student scribes would have had access to in the libraries of their school. As these Nahua students read through the Western canon, they sought biblical and historical analogues to explain their own defeat, and borrowed heavily from mythology to construct a myth of their own defeat. The Moctezuma we must conjure in place of this man who feared the omens is one who was undoubtedly superstitious and sensitive to the needs of his gods, but also enmeshed in the pragmatics of power. He did not need omens to anticipate the coming of the Spaniards. He had, instead, evidence of their existence. And so while Moctezuma did look to the gods for guidance, he was also a master politician, one who was capable of seeing power in the relationships it created. He understood that the empire he resided over was not a fixed entity, but one which was constantly being spun and respun, and one that needed to be weaved together to create a workable pattern of power. The rumors of the Spanish which preceded their arrival upended this, and forced Moctezuma to rework it into a new pattern, which he could not have anticipated, but one he quickly adapted to. It was around the time that the Cortes expedition entered Totonac country that the indigenous began to refer to the Spanish with a word that Bernal Diaz would infamously chronicle as teules, which he said could be understood as gods or demons. The significance of his word, which was actually the Nahuatl word teotl, and its usage has led it to morph into one of the most long-standing and misunderstood theories of Spanish conquest, that Moctezuma believed them to be immortal gods and was too terrified to put up a proper fight against them. The history of this idea can be traced back to the creation of the Florentine Codex once again, as well as a generation of indigenous writers removed from the events in the conquest. Within them are the first recorded instances specifically pushing the angle that Cortés was thought to have been the returned god Quetzalcoatl. The arrival of the Spanish, being interpreted as the return of Quetzalcoatl, appears in the Florentine Codex in its famous Book 12. In this interpretation, a Nahua myth tells of how Quetzalcoatl was a famous prince of these lands who founded Tula, the semi-mythical origin of the Toltec people the Mexica had made so much effort to claim ancestry from. Quetzalcoatl had been banished by his own people and left on a raft of snakes to the east, vowing one day to return. It was said that Cortez's arrival in 1519 coincided with the year Seacat, or One Reed, a year which, like all years in the Aztecs calendar's century, occurred once every 52. It was also said that this god was unique in the pantheon for abhorring human sacrifice and would come back to ban the practice, much like the Spanish attempted to do at every Altepet they encountered. These coincidences, and others like it, led Moctezuma into believing that he was dealing with the return of a god and was cowed into submission, or so the story goes. The reality is thornier. Quetzalcoatl was a known Nahua god, but not one of significance to Moctezuma, who instead worshipped Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the god of rain. The only Altepet where Quetzalcoatl was worshipped as the supreme god was Cholula, whose interaction with the Spaniards was not indicative of a people who believed them to be their god. The other features of Quetzalcoatl's story, that he was a banished god, that he would return, that he hated human sacrifice, have no evidence prior to Spanish contact to support them, only appearing in works like the Florentine Codex after the fact. Again, they were retroactive justifications, historical fables to explain otherwise inexplicable historical evidence, and did not come together into this misunderstood narrative we have today until the 1570s, a half-century after the supposed events took place. What then to make of the indigenous description of the Spanish as teotl, or teule, a word that was without question historically used in the early years of Cortez's expedition? Historian Camilla Townsend believes that the word was used not in the sense that the people of the Aztec Empire believed the Spaniards to be gods themselves, but to relate to them as a people from a land where their god lived. In Townsend's words, the indigenous had to call the Spaniards something, and it was not at all clear what that something should be. In the Nahua universe as it existed up until this point, a person was always labeled as being from a particular village or city-state, or, more specifically, as one who filled a given social role, a tribute collector, prince, servant, etc. These new people fit nowhere. Undoubtedly, they had a village or city-state somewhere, but it was not in the known world, and the relationship to it was not clear. Later, they were called Castilteca, people of Castile, but that came after closer acquaintance. Just as the Mexica of Tenochtitlan were referred to as Tenochca, or the people of Chalco were referred to as Chalcans, identity of groups was associated with the Altepet they came from. The Spaniards, by constantly referencing themselves as being from a land blessed by their god, were referred to as Teules, as a way of acknowledging that the Spanish claimed to be from a land of their own god. Another theory put forth by Hugh Thomas, who commits to the idea that the Aztecs may have at some point actually believed them to be gods, offers his own explanation, that the word did not seem to mean gods in a Christian or even a Greek sense. It indicated a notion of magical charging, possession of a vital fire, a sacred force, which could be physically expressed in a specific presence. Cortés, in his own writings, never claimed that the natives thought of him as a god. The very idea would have struck the man whose religiosity we examined earlier as blasphemous. It is difficult to believe a man who so readily smashed the idols of gods he believed to be false would have happily impersonated one himself, even if it were strategically convenient to do so. Moctezuma is said to have dispelled myths about himself being a god in the first days upon meeting the Spaniards. Upon the meeting of Moctezuma and Cortez, the former is reported to have said that he was aware that Cortez had heard rumors that he, Moctezuma, was a god and claimed to be so, but that he dispelled the rumor by lifting up his clothes and showing his body and said, "And you see that I am of flesh and blood like yourself and everyone else, mortal and tangible." Despite the wealth of historical material pointing against it, the necessity of historical invention has had its thumb on the scale weighted toward an interpretation of the Spanish-Aztec War as one which was haunted by the mystery of the Spaniards and their possibly heavenly origins. But it's simply not true. Moctezuma was never of the belief that these men were gods. So why then did he allow the Spanish to advance ever closer to his city? Of all the riches of Tenochtitlan, perhaps none were as fascinating as the animal collection of Moctezuma, in which he housed in a zoo, perhaps the world's first, and in an aviary, both of which were located within the city's walls. These collections were said to have been so extensive, well-ordered, intensely maintained, aesthetically impressive, and, to foreign eyes, exotic and strange that they drew immediate interest in Europe once they became known. He was also a collector of people, hoarding magicians, tricksters, musicians, dwarves, and others mutilated in childhood to grow into humpbacks to serve as his entertainment. By temperament, the Tlatoani was a seeker of information of the curious and of the strange. He explored the world through conquest and brought back its greatest treasures to be featured in his palaces and other buildings in the capital. The arrival of the Spanish brought in what was one of the strangest groups of people Moctezuma had heard of yet. The tales of their giant boats, strange animals, beards, and fair skin would have greatly interested him even beyond the threat they posed to his empire. From this angle, historian Matthew Restall argues that, like a cat toying with a mouse, for months the emperor was watching the conquistadores, testing them, playing with them, studying them. Even before he could examine them in person, he was gathering accounts and images of them. He was fascinated by these Spaniards. His goal was neither to destroy nor drive the newcomers away, but to confuse, weaken, and draw them in so they could be collected. Montezuma was not afraid of the Spaniards. He was hunting them. When the Cortecistas did set off from Veracruz toward Tenochtitlan, they did so via a route that was indirect and winding. Some say it was because they did not know exactly which way they were going. But Tentlil, Moctezuma's diplomat who had met the Spaniards in Totonac land, had provided them with thousands of indigenous servants who surely knew the way to Tenochtitlan. This route to the capital was known and traversable within days, as Tentlil himself had done. It took the Spanish months to make the journey. Their path wound through territory of Moctezuma's enemies in fringe Altepeme that were of secondary importance to the empire's constituency, but nevertheless may have served, in the Tlatoani's eyes, as important testing grounds for Spanish strength. As we will see, Tlaxcala and Cholula were both, possibly, a way for Moctezuma to put the Spanish to the test, and in the process see if they were strong enough to defeat Mexica enemies. By committing to this strategy of collection and confusion, the Aztec emperor was able to distort the reality around the Spaniards, reflecting their ambition through that same historical hall of mirrors we find ourselves looking back through in our own gaze of history. Everywhere they looked, the Spanish saw their ambitions for greed and power reflected back to them in a land they knew nothing about, and by a people who knew far more about them than the Spaniards could ever claim to understand. Their only link to this world, one interpreter, had enormous leverage to translate both the words of the Spanish and the words of the Nahuatl-speaking people at will, making the Spaniards entirely dependent on her point of view in the chain of translation. Moctezuma's penchant for collecting may have served him well in other circumstances, but it still was a dangerous gambit between him and the Spanish. Moctezuma lords over his war room. Hunched over in front of pictorial reports painted on maguey paper, he stares intently at the information upon them. Looking like the eagle he is so often compared to, he hangs over the nests of his advisors. These advisors flank him on either side, averting their gaze and waiting to be called upon by their Tlatoani. For weeks he has been like this, pensive, deep in consideration of how to respond to these teotl who have, for the third time, landed on his shores. Hardly an hour passes without another report reaching the Tlatoani's eyes. The information painted on this maguey paper is sometimes illuminating, sometimes conflicting. The men, and he has decided that they are men, are sometimes reported as riding beasts, sometimes reported as being melded with them. They have apparently founded an altepet of their own, made of huts and strange buildings on the coast, and then abandoned it, reformed it further north. They are allied with the Totonacs, rebuffed by the Totonacs. Moctezuma sighs deeply and stands up. His advisors do the same. As the Lord starts to leave the room, his advisors follow him. He stops, turns. They avert their eyes suddenly to avoid meeting his, and he dismisses them. He no longer wishes to be in the company, no longer wishes to think of the troubles ahead. He is going to meditate. He leaves the war room of his palace and walks to the black room, a windowless room painted black for the purposes of meditation. A quasi-isolation chamber, this is where the Tlatoani attempts to commune with his gods, the spirits, and himself, whoever is available to give advice and provide clarity in the murky future ahead. Deep in meditation, visions come. In them, Moctezuma sees himself standing on top of Templo Mayor, the very same one he was coronated on 17 years ago. From this vantage point, he can see a catastrophe unfolding around Tenochtitlan. An earthquake shakes loose the ground, and strange warriors with their long beards come pouring out of the fissures. Lake Texcoco drains and then collapses in on itself. Its shoreline advances and encircles the altepet. Moctezuma, in this vision, turns to summon his warriors, but they arrive, missing limbs, scratching at strange blisters across their bodies. Beneath him, surrounding the temple, are the bodies of thousands more. Moctezuma looks up toward the sky, looking for signs of the god's displeasure. He expects chaos above as well as below. But above him, the sun hangs serenely directly above the altepet, as though nothing were amiss. All is well in the heavens as its empire on earth falls apart. The Tlatoani opens his eyes. The darkness of the room overpowers his vision. Suddenly, there is nothing but the sound of his own breathing, the movement of his chest up and down as he breathes. Moctezuma closes his eyes again, but no vision presents itself. The future has disappeared somewhere in the dark. The arrival of the Spanish was, as we have said, no surprise to Moctezuma, who had been preparing for this eventuality at least since 1517 in the sighting of the de Cordoba expedition. After this first spotting of the strangers from beyond the sea, Moctezuma had it watched from various vantage points, and sent court painters to record the numbers of men, deer, and boats. At no point after would Moctezuma be taken again by surprise. The Grijalva expedition was closely monitored, though it ended before major contact could take place. Once Cortez reached the same point where Grijalva's voyage had ended, however, Cortez and his captains, as we know, conspired to continue their expedition in direct contradiction to their orders, remaining in Mesoamerica and fortifying themselves at the spot they now called Veracruz. It was difficult for Moctezuma to know what to do with these men. From his spies, Moctezuma learned that they portrayed themselves as representatives of a great king from beyond the waters. If that were true, then they were emissaries, and in the tradition of Nahua politics, an attack on an emissary was as good as a declaration of war. And it was war which Moctezuma hoped to avoid, understanding both the strength these strangers had demonstrated while also wondering how much more strength lay with the supposed king beyond the sea. So Moctezuma responded in a way that any altepet responded when faced with the prospect of overwhelming military defeat, by offering tribute to the victors. For the Nahua, this tribute was a sign that combat was over and a peaceful relationship could resume. It was not a plea for surrender, but a kind of admission that the Spanish could have what they wanted, gold primarily, if they would respect the custom of taking what they were given and going away. It was also a show of strength, a way of announcing such wealth was trivial to the gift giver and easily parted with. Of course, it did not play out like that. Cortez and his men were not satiated by the gifts they had received, and planned how they would secure more gold and wealth in these new lands. Eventually, they would decide to march on Tenochtitlan and force a meeting with Moctezuma. Seeing that the Spaniards had no intention of leaving, Moctezuma organized his war room where, in the words of the Florentine Codex quoted by James Lockhart, a report of everything that was happening was given and relayed to him. Some of the messengers would be arriving as others went. There was no time when they weren't listening, when the reports weren't being given. Bernal Diaz would also record Cortez as being aware of Mexica spies and observers in every town they passed along the way to Tenochtitlan. In contrast to the image of Moctezuma isolating himself in his palace, despairing of his own superstitions, he was an active planner and strategist attempting to navigate the impossible position he now found himself in. He gathered his council of ministers, as all Tlatoani had at their disposal, and discussed at length with those ministers about what course of action to follow. There seemed to have been disagreements, as one would expect from any council of strong-minded political leaders. Moctezuma's brother Cuitlahua and his cousin Cuauhtemoc formed the most vocal of the anti-Spanish faction, and refused to entertain the suggestion that admitting the Spanish into Tenochtitlan might be a viable strategy of containment. Other strategies were also considered by Moctezuma, including, as historian Hugh Thomas wrote, the council also decided that it would be as well if the magicians of Mexico could be assembled in order to use all their knowledge and power to harm, impede, and frighten off the Castilians in order that they would not dare to come to Mexico. The use of magicians here is significant as, according to Townsend, magicians fought human enemies and not gods. Whether Moctezuma disagreed with his ministers or simply didn't see an alternative is impossible to know, as the history of what would happen plays out only in one way. But the decision to embrace the Spanish and their allies into the city was a political maneuver employed by a man who had spent decades in power. Moctezuma may not have known what would happen next, but he was certainly aware of his responsibility to act within the political calculus presented to him. And that calculus was this. Aztec power was a projection of its strength, and Moctezuma knew that the Aztec were outmatched in relative strength to the conquistadores. Not only did Moctezuma's emissary Tenthwil arrive to make a formal Aztec acknowledgement of these strangers, but also lavished upon them the gifts of gold and silver and jewelry, among others. Moctezuma was already well aware of the Spanish capability in battle and the gap in Aztec technology versus them. Stories of how the Maya warriors at Potonchan had watched as their arrows helplessly bounced off metal armor and their soldiers were trampled to death by giant deer were already well known to Moctezuma. It was clear that a direct attack on the Spaniards risked a catastrophic defeat. And Moctezuma could not risk that defeat. In the words of Camilla Townsend, he knew from his sources that the strangers won their battles. Even if he collected a mighty army and did manage to bring them and their allies down, his kingdom would still be lost, for the casualties would be immense, beyond anything calculable from past experience. And if he could not deliver an easy victory at the heart of his kingdom, his allies would not continue to stand with him. It would not simply be matters of military superiority that concerned him. Quickly, it was understood that these Spanish were not the only ones of their kind. They had to have come from somewhere. And this was understood by Moctezuma, the Tlatoani of a people who famously, in their own telling of their history, had descended from invader ancestors who had come to the Valley of Mexico and upended its existing power structures through a mixture of violence and diplomacy. The existence of more strangers, which Moctezuma may well have assumed were distant relations of his own people from the same ancestors, was not in itself surprising. What did worry Moctezuma was the scale of the ships which brought them over, and the obvious lines of communication and political strategy that had allowed more than one voyage to come over and largely repeat and iterate on previous expeditions. Moctezuma was aware that even if these Spanish were to be defeated in combat, the enormous losses he would suffer would be in vain, when a further expedition surely followed this defeated one. It was obvious to Mexica leaders that the strangers had some form of communicating across distances inconceivable to the Mexica. The use of alphabetic writing and the printing press proved to be an enormous advantage of the Spaniards, and the Mexica, as well as all people of Mesoamerica, were quick to understand its significance. Even before the Spanish-Aztec War began in earnest, Cortez's first Relación had been printed and reproduced in multiple languages in Europe. Accompanying a traveling exhibit of the Aztec treasures that Cortez had sent across the Atlantic while founding Veracruz, this letter and craftsmanship of Aztec art had enchanted Europe by the year 1520. There was no comparable awareness of the European continent from the Aztecs, beyond what they were able to learn directly through conversation with La Malinche, for a time the only Nahua who could communicate at all with the Spaniards. Later, Franciscan friars running the school in Tlatelolco would be amazed at how quickly their Nahuatl-speaking students were able to grasp the advantages of the Latin alphabet to convert their spoken language into a written one. But that was still years away and after the defeat of the Aztecs. All of these Spanish advantages were obvious to Moctezuma, and the decisions he would make between November 1519 and April 1520 should not be seen as a surrender, but a strategy for isolating and observing the Spanish. In a true expression of keep your enemies closer, Moctezuma had made the decision that it was better to hold the Spanish inside Tenochtitlan, where they could be observed and probed for weaknesses, rather than having them move around the empire unimpeded, attacking or recruit as various Altepeme, out of reach of the Mexica. Again quoting historian Camilla Townsend, the Spanish numbered only about 500, the city folk 250,000. The Spanish had only one translator to tell them what was occurring. Moctezuma's people could watch every move that the Spaniards made. Simply to eat every day, the Spaniards were desperately dependent on those they dreamed of ruling. To an extent, this strategy did work. As we will see in our future episode on Pánfilo de Narváez, Moctezuma was eventually able to parse out divisions within the Spanish Empire that he would then attempt to exploit. That this plan ended disastrously for nearly everyone involved does not mean that it was a poor strategy. Even the best laid plans can lead to ruin. But how those plans unfolded in detail will have to be revisited later, when we bring Cortez and Moctezuma to their famous meeting on the southern causeway outside Tenochtitlan. For now, we will leave Moctezuma here, having seen not so much of the man but his shadows cast by contradicting torches of historical illumination. These shadows of the man take either the shape of a coward, a fanatic, or a master of realpolitik. His true form is essentially unknowable to us, and so we must settle for the shadows. In the histories written after the fact, there were many indigenous who cast him as a traitor to his own people, someone who unlocked the door for the Spanish and let them in. To others, he was a visionary whose vision failed to materialize for reasons within and without his control. The truth, however one may define it, may be something darker than either. What if Moctezuma, much like us now, was locked in the grip of his own hallucinations? What if Moctezuma, like Tlacaelel before him, had stared into the blinding light of the fifth sun of his own for too long, a sun which then burned into his vision something that could not be differentiated from the reality surrounding him? The signs, the omens, the rumors, both historical and not, were not metaphorical to him. They were instead data. Moctezuma was a devotee of Huitzilopochtli, its highest priest. From birth, he was raised to believe that the gods dictated history and that his role was simply to facilitate their desires. His city was a fulcrum between heaven, earth, and the underworld, and he saw himself as its universal center. This faith meant that he never believed that the Spanish were gods themselves, but the work of his gods, and their arrival remained an open question. The ultimate tragedy of Moctezuma was not that he was paralyzed into inaction. It's that he saw it all coming and still could not take final control over the events that would play out. Caught in the grip of these hallucinations, he played a game against his own shadows as the threat of the Spanish marched toward his door, or so the legend goes. And now we are left with only the legend of Moctezuma, and legends, perhaps even more than the people who inspire them, are subject to the endless revision of history and its believers. And what do you do with a legend resurrected and revised? You do to Moctezuma what we so often do with history's legends of all kinds. Name a street after him, build a statue, and tell a story that builds the myth and forgets the man. But under the stone of those streets and those monuments, behind the popular history repeated in those classrooms, and across the bitter arguments of contemporary politics, the ghost of Moctezuma still lives. The hallucination remains breathing. Next week, we will turn our attention to another monumental figure in the history of the Spanish-Aztec War, but one that, unlike so many others in this history, barely exists in its record, with even her true name being unknown. Whatever you call her, she was the tongue that spoke between two worlds, bringing them together like no other visual. To the Nahua, she was Malintzin. To the Spanish, she was Doña Marina. To history, she is known as La Malinche. Whatever you call her, she was the tongue that spoke between two worlds, bringing them together like no other individual could, only to, ironically, see herself silenced in the history that she so crucially shaped. Her voice built an empire, and her silence haunts its ruins. And so that's all for this episode of Can't Go Back, Won't Move On. Written, narrated, and produced by Gavrilo Z, with music composed and performed by Jake Krasiniak. If you like the show, tell your friends. All my listeners are appreciated. Goodbye.